Hi, everyone. I'm
Hey,
Tom. Yeah, I wrote the book, and Wayne.
hey, thank you, Melanie. Thank you for the Center for Fiction and everyone for joining us tonight. And as Melanie said, I'm Wayne Ho. I run the Chinese American Planning Council, which is the largest Asian American social services nonprofit in the country, and we're based here in New York City, Tom's hometown. And now that Tom's in my original hometown in California, thank you everyone for joining. Please use the Q&A as we said so I can monitor the questions. And what we'll do tonight is Tom and I will have a discussion going on for until about 6:40, 6:45. And then I will start going in through the questions and answers and trying to get through as many questions as possible. Um, so with that, Tom, welcome. I've read the book. It's very exciting. I don't want to spoil anything for our guests here tonight. Um, but as you know, as someone who's also Asian American, Chinese American, we're usually told to be a doctor, go into business, not necessarily to become a writer. So can you share with us, how did your family react when you decided to become an author?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I was also told to be a doctor. Lawyer actually didn't come up as much for me, surprisingly. But so both my parents are in the medical field. My dad's a surgeon in China. My mom's a nurse in New York. And so I think they kind of just viewed doctor as being a very safe and lucrative profession. But I think they were confused at first that I wanted to be a writer, but ultimately they came around to it and they ended up being very supportive. I think they didn't discourage me from being a writer out of a desire to prevent me from doing that, but I think more so out of a kind of love and a desire not to see me work really hard at something and then come up empty, kind of out of like pragmatism. But ultimately, they were very supportive, and so I went to Pomona and I majored in English, and then they were also even supportive of grad school in English, which is that's a hard get. But I actually was talking about something like this question with this Sacramento Bee, and I mentioned that my parents always told me that they work hard so I don't have to, and that was actually the subject of a very long text that I got in the group chat last week, admonishing me. I should have said, my mom says I should have said that my parents have always raised me to work hard at something I do like. So they wanted me to clarify that they told me that they work hard at something they don't like, so I can work hard, if not harder, at something I do like. Because God forbid people think that they raised me to be lazy.
Uh, so thanks for being transparent about that. So you already started mentioning your family. So could you tell us how your identity has influenced your writing?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a Chinese American. I was born in Beijing, and I moved to Australia at 2, Sydney, and then I came to New York at 4, and we settled down in Flushing. Um, and I think in terms of how it influenced my writing, I think a lot of it has to do with this the question of where home is, or where I think of as being a return. And yeah, I live in Davis, California, but I think one thing that I noticed was when I speak to my parents about visiting them in New York, I use the verb hui. Hui New or return to New York. And when I lived in New York for that 1 year between college and grad school, I would say hui jiazhou, return to California. And whenever we talk about going to China, we always say Huiguo, or return to country. Even though at this point we've been in the States for 21 years. So it seems like there's these kinds of linguistic or syntactical markers in just like the way that I talk that kind of reveal that I think about home as always being just the place that I just left and I can't get back to for a while. And I think that uh, part of like kind of a displaced home or a retrospective home is pretty central to my feeling of being Chinese American and moving around so much as a kid, is this idea of like seeking a return or seeking a place that you could return to, and I think that comes through in the writing as kind of this desire for some place that you've left and are prohibited from returning.
Yeah, and I think that when you mention the word return, that's obviously a theme that plays out in the novel, The Thousand Crimes of Ming Tsu. So to dig into the book a little bit, then, could you share with us why you chose to write a Western?
Yeah, I mean, I just think the Western is such a fun genre first. I mean, like it's very like it's got, I love action movies, and so the Western is just like this kind of action-packed, totally saturated genre that has a lot of room for fun. But it also is a really powerful device. It's a really like potent socio-cultural kind of machine, and it's a machine for making the American myth of what happened in the West when we kind of like cut cut down frontiers and expanded all the way to the Pacific and like committed kind of horrible crimes and like genocides along the way. That we have this thing called the Western, which is this genre that like codifies and produces a kind of coherent narrative about like the ends and the means of that conquest. And so I think it's like it's this kind of really powerful weapon almost for perpetuating a certain kind of supremacist narrative. And so it was almost a desire to like hijack, commandeer, usurp that machine and use it to my own ends. To use that myth making machine of the Western and have it make new myths to expand the field of what could be possible, what kind of stories could be possible in the West. And I also just really loved the landscape, and I wanted to like kind of write a book that paid tribute to how it felt to like drive through the desert and like like pick up sand at outside of the road, and just like capture that feeling while also being aware of this kind of body of cultural force that undergirds the genre.
And I think it's interesting for you to bring up what's in the genre, American West, it's genocide. And I think more and more folks have been talking about, obviously, Asian American history, especially during now with all the Asian American violence going on, anti-Asian violence going on. So in the story, you don't hit the reader over the head with Asian American history, but you obviously allude to a lot of what happened on the railroads and the violence and that Chinese Americans face. Was that a conscious decision of yours to not go too deeply into Asian American history or Chinese American history, but just to weave it into the story line, into the main character's experience?
Yeah, because I think like there's history is something that is created like post facto. History is kind of written and modulated after it's already happened, and the way that we talk about history that's happening to us right now is just lived experience. And so I wanted to kind of because there are plenty of history books about the experience of Asian Americans during that time, and they're all fantastic. And what I wanted the Thousand Crimes of Ming Tsu to be was almost like what was it like to live in that history? What was it like for that history to become lived experience, like to become the present with all of its intensities and confusions? And so I think, and I did a lot of research because I wanted it to be true. I wanted it to be to be accurate. But I let that research kind of structure the background of the story so that when he comes up against almost invisible blockades or like legislative hurdles that he doesn't really understand but has to work his way around. That the book is deformed by these invisible forces of the racism and the kind of the way that it was codified at that time, but it doesn't explicitly mention any of them because they become baked into the experience of kind of going through the book. They're part of what it's like to be alive at that time and not any kind of history that we're putting back onto it when we think about it.
Yeah, I think to this point about history, it's interesting, right? Because this is obviously a historical novel, historical fiction, and as part of it, you mentioned about histories written by the victors, and some strong themes that come through in the story is really around what's real, what's not. There's as gritty as it gets into with how it does feel to be in the West. There's a lot of fluidity on reality and dream, whether it's a dream or not a dream at certain points. And obviously, memory is played with a lot. So, could you share why you chose some of these themes around memory and reality and dreams and fantasy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to preface because I was kind of trained as a literary critic, I suppose first, and then began seriously doing fiction. And so I think I have a lot of the baggage of being very hands off with textual analysis. Roland Barthes talks about the death of the author, and he says, the birth of the reader must be at the death of the author. I would love not for that not to be the case. But But I think, I am thinking of memory as kind of like a way to think about identity. And what it is like this question of what makes you you, like where is the root of personal identity. John Locke has this kind of the first theory of metaphysical identity, which is he says that personal identity is what you can remember. It's the memory theory of identity. And this guy Thomas Reed has a counterexample, and he says, let's consider a brave officer who is beaten as a kid for stealing an apple, and then later he like has a very successful military campaign, and then at the end of his life he becomes a general. And let's say that each of these stages he remembers the last stage, but at the end of his life he's so old that he doesn't remember being a boy. And so he says, well, this raises a contradiction that you can somehow be the same person as the person who you were, some amount of time ago, but not the same person all the way to the beginning. And for philosophers, this is a fatal counterexample because it raises a contradiction. But because I'm not a philosopher, I think it's actually really really fascinating to think about, kind of non-rigorously, this idea of is it possible to be someone? Is it possible to be the same person that you were all through the past and also be totally different from that person? Is identity something that is both constant and changeable, simply by forgetting something or remembering something incorrectly? And I think that question of memory also spills over into that fluidity that you're talking about with reality and dreams. Because I think one thing that is really interesting to me is this idea of what kind of experience we have when we're waking versus when we're dreaming, like a kind of active versus passive experience of perception. And I think by kind of flipping back and forth between realities and dreams and memories, so often I wanted to trouble those clear boundaries between those different modes of existence, and kind of use that uncertainty to create a space where like anything could happen, even magic, or talking animals.
And we're going to get to the talking animals in a sec. I want to encourage our participants tonight to please drop questions into the Q&A. I'm monitoring those right now. But let's dig into the character. So Ming Tsu, he's Chinese American assassin in the 1800s, does not speak Chinese. But he's obviously identified as Chinese American throughout. They call him John, which I think you should explain to some of our guests tonight why that is. But how did you conceive of this character specifically, Ming Tsu, and his backstory?
Yeah. So he's an orphan. His parents came to the States to work, and they passed away, and so he was an orphan. He's raised by this crime boss, Silas Root. But the a lot of the kind of the facts about Ming Tsu that seem to be remarkable are actually quite commonplace. And for instance, his wife that he's looking for in California is a white woman. And that is actually, if you look at the history, there's like Erica Lee has this great book, The Making of Asian America, which actually goes into this. And also, I want to say, I think Emma Tang had a book about this a couple of years ago as well, which is about interracial couples and kind of interracial identities at the turn of the century. But it was actually quite common for these interracial pairings to happen because only 5% of the Chinese immigrants who came to the U.S. At around 1860, only about 5% of them were female. The rest of them were all male laborers who either had family back home or who were trying to come here and really make it and send money back and retire back in China, significantly wealthier. So if a migrant had come here and wanted to start a family, he wouldn't really have many options other than going outside their own community. And I think the other thing that was interesting to me was that, like, going back to that thinking about how laws and legislature are kind of deforming the course of the story, like invisibly, without explicitly acknowledging them. There are all of these different laws that start getting passed kind of the second that a Chinese migrant sets foot on American soil. These laws start to kick in California. There's a foreign miners tax, which is passed, I think, in 1850, and then 2 years later it's increased. So very quickly, they're trying out all these different deterrents. In 1860, only law is passed saying that only white children can attend public schools. In 1863, it becomes a crime to give testimony on behalf of or against a white person in court. And that specifically applies to Mongolians and Chinese. In 1850, an anti-miscegenation law was passed in California. That's actually not struck down until 1948. So almost 100-year run of this racist law prohibiting interracial marriage. But it's all of these facts going to become washed away and elided in our received history of what that time was like. And I think it's that kind of these stories are actually not that remarkable. And Ming's character, he's an assassin, which I would hope is pretty remarkable. But the other facts about his character are actually quite commonplace at the time, and really derived from historical facts and like legislative histories.
Yeah, and I think that obviously where the time you write versus the time you're writing about is different. So during that time, the language that was being used towards Chinese Americans is very different. So obviously right now, there's a lot of consciousness around hashtag Stop Asian Hate, the use of offensive terms and whether they should or should not be used in stories. There's always discussion, for example, about the N-word being used in Mark Twain's novels. In your book, you use the term Chinaman a lot, which is obviously a term that was used a lot back then, and some people still use it today. A lot of us in the Asian American community do feel that term is very offensive. So how did you make the choice to use that term in the story, and how did you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a brutal term, and it really it unfolds so much like horrible historical context in it. And I think that the context and the connotations that come with that word are precisely why I felt like it was important not to strike it from the novel. That I think I wanted to hew closely to the poison of racism and not dilute it even a little bit, because I think with that kind of almost revisionist tendency or desire to kind of mollify the past to make it more amenable to the present, I think is to run the risk of accidentally rehabilitating or excusing that history. And I think it's important. It was important to me that this term, that the reader encounter it and have to kind of grapple with it, because it kind of hits you in the face each time it happens, and it also it encodes a kind of stance, a broad stance towards Asian Americans at the time, which is John. So people frequently call him John, and John is actually a historical term for any kind of Asian American at that time. John is actually short for John Chinaman. And if you look at some of these records from the time, or like eyewitness accounts that newspaper reporters are sending back, you'll see a lot. They'll mention, John waved his hat as he was coming down the railroads, or John picks up a thing of rocks. And I remember when I was first starting out research, I was like, I gotta figure out who this John is. And it quickly became apparent that what the phrase John Chinaman and what that term Chinaman really represents is this kind of collapse, this dimensional reduction of Asian American identity into a single kind of fungible person who could be anyone. John Chinaman is any Asian person at all. And so it represents this kind of total annihilation of identity and individuality. And even that first name, John, like it positions the Asian American immigrant in America at that time, it positions them with relation to European structures of naming and knowledge. And so I think it was important to me to not modify or attenuate the racism of the period, because I think part of it is to reproduce that kind of violence, the violence of words and of course also of actions.
Yeah, and then since you've mentioned violence, this is a Western. Obviously, there's a lot of violence in Westerns. And it seems to me that death is obviously a big theme throughout this story too. There's a lot of death that happens, but in some ways, death seems like its own character. So to violence and death in Westerns, were these concepts in Westerns that you embraced in your story?
Yeah, I think so. Jane Tompkins has this book called West of Everything, and I think it was in the '90s, and it is kind of this kind of critical evaluation of the Western as a genre. And one of the things that Tompkins talks about is that the Western sells this fantasy, this ideal which is she calls it the totally saturated moment. This kind of this mode of experience where the only thing that you can think of, the only thing that occupies your entire soul and your being is simply activity and doing things. And then Tompkins goes on to kind of argue that like violence is one form of this totally saturated moment, where like the violence of a Western is always is pure in that there is nothing else beyond that violence, and the kind of the the, the horror and the force of violence then becomes used in all these other associations and relations to kind of build out what it's like to exist as a totally saturated individual. But I think one thing that felt important to me about violence, especially in westerns, was that in the old school westerns, violence is part of them, and it's always a settler colonial violence. It's always a violence that is directed at non-white peoples, a lot of whom are like kind of never even named or described, um, and and so it becomes kind of that violence falls in service of this kind of broader theme of colonialism and expansionist genocide. And so I wanted to take that violence and turn it on its head and kind of put it into this flow of a revenge story that saw that violence being propagated outwards, against settlers and the people who were like dominating this land, and see if that violence could stand on its own, to see if it was an integral part of the Western, that whether or not it could be separated from or changed from its character of being always lethal towards non-whites, whether that violence was something that could be repurposed or that could survive this kind of new expansion of a Western.
Yeah, and I think to this idea of turning it on its head, obviously you have a Chinese American assassin as the protagonist, and I already mentioned there's a lot of murders in this, so everybody joining us tonight should have a sense of where the revenge story is heading. Um, but as a reader, I remember it seemed like the first murder that happened was maybe 2 sentences, 3 sentences, and then later on, some of the other murders end up being 3 page, 4 page descriptions of the murders. Um, so, was that something that you planned in your writing, and how did you? And was that something you wanted readers to react to in the details that you went into in the murders as the story went along?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this kind of spectrum that I had in my mind of a gradual increase as the story and Ming Tsu both move closer to the west, closer to their destination, and to California, that things become more intense and more fantastical. All things, experience and activity, and also the violence and the murders. And I think another thing is that like uh, Ming, his body is each time his body is recruited to commit these murders, his body then remembers that, and so each time it becomes closer to the body. These descriptions become more visceral, and I think also a little more divorced from reality. They're a little more like kind of hyper real, that they have qualities that are more either aesthetic or like or even um, like hallucinatory. That the violence is not so coded as violence, as it increases in detail and length, that it becomes kind of almost a different kind of activity for Ming to do. But I think that there's a lot of it is going to be reader response to those murders, because um, as he grows closer to his goal, and as he grows closer to California, there's a sense that he's lost something. That's something, he started with something in Utah that maybe isn't all the way there with him, as he finishes his revenge, and to kind of think and look through those acts of extreme violence, and think whether or not they were taking something from him or converting something of his personality into a different, harder thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned fantastical elements, and we started out talking about the genre of a western, but it seems along the way that he meets a traveling carnival where almost all the characters have some sort of superpowers or otherworldly powers. Um, how did you decide to incorporate these fantasy elements into a western story?
I think the Western is already so intense and wild, and already so hyper real. Like even in the kind of the old canon of westerns, characters will get shot in the leg and then show up 3 chapters later, like in a town, like bandaging their leg. Like the Western already contains these elements of like total unreality. And so it actually didn't feel like I was adding much when when you add in a fireproof woman and a shapeshifter and someone who can speak into other people's minds. And I think adding in those fantastical elements also feels truer to me, and I think reflects more what it really feels like to kind of stand in a desert or stand in the in midday heat and just feel kind of your mind being blown away by how hot it is and how you can't take a breath. And there's something that feels really intense and magical about that. And I think putting that right into the narrative and reproducing that by adding real magic, I think it was a fun way to go about making sure that that experience was communal between me and the reader.
Yeah, I was just watching a lot of the Marvel movies with my kids, so I was trying to, in my head, I kept picturing like you could sell this as either a superhero story or you could do this as a Western story. As we talk about distinct characters in the book, um, oftentimes it felt like animals were characters too. Ming's relationship with his horses, to I believe was it coyotes at the end,
Uh,
near the end.
yeah, there's a cougar, yeah,
Or cougar, sorry, a
yeah.
cougar and his interaction with the cougar. So, um, how did you envision including animals into the stories, and was it a conscious decision to make them almost their own distinct characters?
Yeah, I think animals are. I think of them as being. I've always really liked animals. I think of them as being kind of closer to ground or like closer to the land, and of course, that also raises different questions of like native species versus invasive species. But I think that this concept of animals in the story really, to me, seems close to this idea of like genius loci, this natural protective spirit that like it comes from the land, knows the land intimately, and kind of reflect the intentions of the land. And I think the other thing about Ming is that he doesn't have the powers that his companions have. He doesn't have anything really world changing or mind bending. But what he does have is this kind of weird ability to cathect with animals, to kind of really feel out and understand these agents who are not human and also not fully natural. And I think adding in those interactions really helped me to make him feel more supernatural, more almost not of this world. That he was operating on the land kind of as a different kind of being, one who the animals can recognize and kind of guide.
Great, thanks for that. I have a few more questions, but I see some questions popping up in the Q&A, so I want to make sure to get to our audience questions. And I encourage everyone who's in the audience with us today, please put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to get through as many as we can. Um, Sandra has a question about the Western genre is known for white male hypermasculinity, which I think you've alluded to. So how did you approach that issue when determining how to draw Ming Tsu or
Yeah,
write Ming
I
Tsu?
think yeah. I think the the white male hypermasculinity that the Western genre espouses is often that one that comes at the cost of the suffering of others. That like the white male is not hypermasculine in a vacuum. He's hypermasculine because he inflicts damage and harm to the people who are not himself. He extracts resources from the land, and he dominates the area that he travels through. And I think in the classical westerns, that's always been used as a way to attribute that kind of power to every white man. And so I think that's why it was also so appealing as a kind of American myth making device, was that it suggested that all American white men could someday aspire to go into the desert and kill a buffalo and commit atrocities. And I think the other thing that becomes interesting is when you take those tropes and you subvert them by applying them to someone who is not white, who is not male, who's kind of working at these things from a position of alterity and marginalization. And I think it also is an interesting conversation with the way that Asian American men are often feminized or emasculated and actually, the origins for that are pretty interesting. But but they have to do with kind of every function of a white supremacist society attempting to protect itself against alterity, against the threat of the other. And so these a lot of the Chinese laborers who stayed in the U.S. Picked up jobs as cooks and laundrymen, which were considered very feminine jobs. But those are the only jobs that they could do, and they could own a business, and they could turn a profit. And so they became associated with all these things. But there was also an interesting discomfort with how to characterize the threat of Asian American migrants. And there's a lot of history of like kind of really fascinating ways that that the popular press tries to characterize the threat of Asian men as kind of lecherous seductors who would steal away America's white women, and Asian women as being equally seductive and lethal to American masculinity. And so I think taking all those things, gathering them up, and then trying to make Ming Tsu embody only the most abstract versions of that hypermasculine dream, I think I find it very fruitful to kind of put him through those paces and see what perturbations come out of him passing through that story, just as the other.
Yeah, as we're digging into Ming Tsu, Grace has a great question. Do you want the reader to think of Ming Tsu as a hero?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I think of him as a hero, but then again, as the author, I don't want to I don't want to provide peculiar authority. I think I think of Ming Tsu as being someone who would like to be the hero, who would want there to be an end or a justification for his actions and the way that he behaves. And I think part of the book is him searching for that thing that will justify and motivate him, that is right and good. And I think he struggles a lot with whether or not he is good, whether he is a moral agent. And he has a couple of conversations. I don't want to spoil them, but he has a couple of conversations where he tries to figure out, where he tries to come to an answer about that for himself. Because whether or not he's a hero matters to him, because it means that some of his things become either heroic, justified, correct, or kind of despicable and alienating.
So you've mentioned doing research for the book, and Eunice has a question about the research you did for the book beyond just a few of the books that you've already mentioned. Did you learn anything from the research that changed your perception of the history of race relations in America?
I That's a really great question. I did a lot of research, both in books and kind of field work. I went to I tried to go to as many of the places that show up in the book as I could, and kind of take pictures and take notes. And I drove along the 80, kind of east to west, a bunch of times to kind of get a sense of the place. But does it affect my view of the history of race relations in America? I think if anything, it only shows how far back the current problems go. It only shows how structurally invariant some of the ways that American society like encodes racism and reproduces it. It only shows how far back that goes. That some of the things that we respond to, that we are horrified by today, are actually, and I think Joe Biden actually said, at one point he was talking about the Asian hate crimes, and he was saying it's un-American. And you hear something like that and you think it's one of the most American things out there is structural violence against alterity, against people of color, that it goes all the way back to the very founding of this country. And so I think um, what instead becomes clear is that it's not a history of race relations becoming better or worse throughout history, but rather becoming relevant. Mark Jung, who was a professor here at Davis, actually has this book on racial world making, which is about fiction and the way that fiction tells us when to notice race, when it's important, and when we should kind of pay attention to it. And I think this is one of those cases where you see this flow of legislature and also of immigration kind of changing in respect to one another as we go through history, because at certain points, race and different kinds of racialized perceptions become more important because they serve some kind of broader end. And so you know, but it's a really great question about the history of race relations in America. I, I think my answer to that would just be it goes all the way back to the start, and that's something that we have to grapple with every day.
Yeah, for all transparency, I'm also, besides being an English major, also was an ethnic studies major too. But I think that what you just said is that I remember during the last 5 years of our previous president, what the current president was saying, that a lot of people are saying like, oh, we're better than this. America is better than this. This is not who we are. But I think to your point, I think there's a lot of folks, especially communities of color, immigrant communities, who can say, our communities have always dealt with anti-immigrant laws, structural violence against us too. So I think it's a really good question on how to explore that through a protagonist who's Chinese living during these times. Um, you touched upon this a little bit. Elizabeth has a question about how did you research the landscape itself? And I want to acknowledge there were plenty of times, every time they wiped blood on their sleeve or waking up in the mud or things like that, I could feel it. It was very gritty and very real. And I hate being dirty. So I think that's where that is a great question. How did you research the landscape?
Um, I try to go to those places in each case. I think right at the beginning, Ming is walking through the salt flats just west of Salt Lake, and this thing is happening where he has to knock salt off of his boots because it's sticking to them because it's April and the rains have just kind of come in, and so the whole salt flats are still kind of sticky. And that's because I had that experience because I like experienced intense irritation at having to kind of walk out and take these photos and every couple of steps like knock all of this heavy salt off of my boots. And while I was there, I also, you know, and I think some of the things that I did were probably too much. Like I tasted the salt at the Bonneville Salt Flats. You know, it's salt. Like I wouldn't recommend that anyone else do it. It's pretty self-explanatory. But he goes to a lake towards the end of the book, and he tastes the water, and he says that it's you know saline but drinkable. And I actually couldn't make it to that lake while I was writing it, but I did look up the average salinity of that lake and then mock up a glass of the lake water at home with like table salt and tap water, and I drank the whole glass, and I figured that seems fine. So I think a lot of it is about trying to relate the landscape first to my body, and then to then take that experience and then body it outwards as well, and kind of pass the landscape first through my own perception and my own experience, and then write about what that felt like. And I think in doing so, I felt like I could get closer to reality, closer to the feeling of being
Um, yeah, those are great descriptions. That's a big experiment, drinking salty water. So I'm glad you made it. um, so you spoke a little bit about the research that you're doing and that you did travel. So Mimi has a question about, could you speak a little to your process and timeline in writing the novel? Did you begin the novel when you were an undergrad?
Yeah, so I was in a workshop with Jonathan Lethem, and I had this short story that I turned in for my workshop, and that I think is the earliest form of what it eventually came out to be, Thousand Grounds of Ming Tsu. And that one shared with this current book only two things, which is that it was broadly a Western and that the main character was in Ming Tsu. Um, but it was kind of this one-off idea, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I couldn't shake it. And I was also, you know, in California, so I was also driving around all the time. And every time I would drive around and like check out a desert or you know a national park, I'd just be like struck by this sense that I needed to say something about it. I needed to kind of bring it out into the world. And so that idea of a Western with a Chinese American protagonist really stuck with me. And then after I graduated, I decided I would really like go in all the way on this and try to write the book. And that was extremely slow going. I spent a lot of that time researching instead, which I find easier than writing. And so a lot of times I would be like, I'm going to sit down and write, and I would end up just collecting a bunch of documents and maps. But then ultimately I came to Davis, and it was September 1st. I had maybe a third or a little more than a third of the novel written at that point, and I knew that as soon as I started grad school, it would never be finished. Um, and so my furniture hadn't arrived, all of it yet. So I had an armchair, and an outlet. And I sat and I looked at all my outlines and I wrote every single day until class started. And that got me within a stone's throw of the end. I finished it up, revised it, and that was in 2019. And now it's 2021. So
Yeah, no, congratulations. I know this is your first novel, and I'm sure seeing it in hard copy and getting that delivery is a great feeling. Um, so Bowen has a question. If you have any thoughts on the relationship between literature and fiction and the efforts of nonprofit organizations such as CPC.
yeah, I mean, I think those that kind of connection is extremely important because it allows for the consideration of kind of both sides of this of like the material support of existence and like aid as well as this kind of other side of like seeing seeing representation and people like you kind of become part of the culture and kind of instill a sense of having having a voice or like having something that is going around that people are thinking about. And I think the one enables the other. um, you know Without the material conditions for just subsistence and comfortable living, I would never have been able to write something like this. And my hope is that by writing something like this, people will think closely about this kind of experience and turn that into like actionable good for everyone else around them. And I think they're very closely related, and um, I think I often forget that, and I feel like I'm writing into a vacuum. And so it's good to remember that there is another half to this machine of cultural support and material support that like helps actual people and brings them together and takes care of them.
Yeah, and I think just to that point too, that right now, as we know, there's been a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. That a lot of us on the nonprofit side have been saying that the solution is not necessarily more incarceration of the
Right.
perpetrators, but what can we do around education, so we don't get to this point of what can we do about root causes. So a lot of us have been talking about education, Asian American histories, Asian American studies, which obviously literature is a key part of that too. So I'm hoping that this book is one of the ones that actually is taught a lot, so people can get educated, not just on history, because once again, you don't bang people over the head with it, but you weave it into the story that you're telling. Speaking of the story you're telling, Anne is asking if you've read the comic Kingsway West by Greg Pak. Kingsway Law is a similar character, and we need more characters like this.
I actually haven't, but I will make a note of that because that sounds really interesting and cool. So I'm actually gonna jot that down.
You should jot that down. So, and Greg Pak lives 10 blocks from me in Brooklyn. So it's always good to
No
connect with
kid.
Greg on these things. Um, so please keep the questions coming. We have about 10 minutes left, and I still have a few questions I want to tell or I want to ask, but please keep the questions coming. So Benjamin has a question that the word cinematic has been used to describe your novel, and some have noted a stylized Tarantino-esque approach to the violence. This comparison reminds him of the film Inglourious Basterds, which also reimagines or imagines an alternate history of Jewish operatives trying to assassinate Nazi leadership. Was there any of that impulse with Ming Tsu, an opportunity to imagine an alternative history to this era of the West, that you wanted to right or wrong artistically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I loved Inglourious Basterds, and I'm a big fan of Tarantino. And I think the craziest thing about Inglourious Basterds is you're watching the film, and the entire time, if you hadn't heard anything about the film, you're thinking, at what point is the shoe going to drop, and they're going to, they're going to be killed. At what point are they going to fail, and Hitler survives? And then when they get to the scene where they're like just emptying machine guns into Hitler, you're like, oh, like this is a different kind of cultural creation. This is not one that is concerned with history, but actually with the feeling of justice, like a kind of exaggerated narratival justice that provides a story that you can think about, if not in actuality, but kind of just subjectively to counter the horrors of the past. And I think there's definitely something like that at work in The Thousand Crimes of Ming Tsu. And part of it is also that, like, I mean, I loved Inglourious Basterds, but I thought that scene was a little too much. The when they really kill Hitler, like I think that it is there's a point past which the revenge fantasy becomes almost cartoonish or unreal. And I wanted to pull back right before that point, to kind of dance up to the point of wish fulfillment, and then have that other shoe drop, or at least partly, and kind of, bring him back to ground, and have him reckon with these factors that are actually beyond his power. Like I think what Inglorious Bastards leaves out is this kind of post facto of the revenge fantasy, which is like killing Hitler doesn't remove Nazism, right? It doesn't like de-radicalize all these people. You've actually just done something which is an end in itself, and doesn't continue further past that. And I think part of what I was thinking is having to cope with that, or this idea that like you can't actually just do one revenge narrative and fix everything. The justice is much harder than that.
Yeah, and I think to that, for folks who haven't read the book, read it through the end, because the other shoe does drop in the story. So there's a couple more questions here I want to get to in our last 5 minutes. So are there other Chinese American authors or any other authors you want to make sure that people read?
The one that I have been reading that I really like recently is Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, which is like, and I think the way that I think about it, I can justify it as a Western because it happens in Los Angeles, and it's like kind of about the same themes. But that's just a great book. It's so incisive, and it can go from being like hilarious to totally devastating in just the span of a couple pages. So that one's a really great one. And the authors, of course, that come up a lot, I think, when people are talking about this kind of this wave of new westerns. C. Pam Zhang, How Much of These Hills Is Gold, which is very, it's very lyrical, and it's also, I think of it as almost like sparse, like a very strong, but almost like the West becomes an unfinished space in How Much of These Hills Is Gold, a space that like people kind of have to negotiate and then create. I think that's something that's very very nice about that one. And Jenny Tinghui Zhang has a book coming out, I think, in 2022, which I'm very excited about, which I think is what used to be called Five Chinese Hanged in Idaho, and the new name of it I'm blanking on, but she is. I'm really looking forward to that book, and I think it's gonna be really cool. But I think there's, the Western is a really robust genre. It's a hard genre to kill. So I think we're starting to see a lot of people play with it in ways that are fruitful and interesting and unexpected. And I think it's really cool to kind of to like be like, oh, I guess those are my peers. It really doesn't feel like that, but it's cool to be part of this wave.
Yeah, and I think thank you for the Center for Fictions dropping in the links in the chat, so people should click on those for the authors that were mentioned by Tom. Do you envision that your future work will focus on the Chinese American experience or have Chinese American protagonists?
Yeah, I think something that really stymied my kind of start in writing fiction was that I was writing a lot of stories about white people and about the experiences of white people because I thought that's what stories were about. Because I was like reading all these books and there was always a white protagonist, and so I would be trying to write about something from this kind of perspective that is not my own, and I would be kind of trying to suppress all of these things that didn't belong to that perspective because it wasn't my own. And so I don't think I can get around having Chinese American protagonists, Chinese American characters and experiences in my future work. And I think discovering that that writing those things felt more true than anything I'd ever written before. I think those were that was like the epiphany that I had about writing. So I definitely think that going forward, it's always going to be a part of what I produce.
Great. So a few more folks have put some author recommendations in the Q&A, so we'll try and drop that into the chat. But in our last couple minutes, do you have, now that you're a published author, do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
It doesn't really feel like I should be allowed to give out advice, but I think, just kind of following off of me writing about Chinese American experiences, I think write what you know is kind of cheesy, and I think it often becomes bastardized into like write about your exact career and job experience. But I think there is there is a fear or a or an apprehension, I think, for a lot of people to write about something that feels close to them because they think it might be too ordinary, or otherwise not interesting. And so I think, I mean, I at least I definitely I tried to reach for things that felt more important or larger or grander, and I ended up coming up totally empty because I had not only did I was trying to write about something that I had never experienced, but actually like I was trying to put things there that didn't belong there. And so being able to kind of pull that back and write closely and think about like think about what was it like to be me and to experience the things that I experienced. I think that was very important. So I think my advice to aspiring authors would be like really write what you know, but in this in the kind of the broadest sense of the word. Oh, Four Treasures of the Sky, Jenny Tung Hui Zhang. That's coming out in 2022.
To the theme of writing what you know, and Sandra, thanks for being kind. You're asking me a question about how I see fiction fitting into the work of nonprofits like CPC. I think something that we as all Asian Americans always deal with are stereotypes. Model minority, we all do well, perpetual foreigner, the objectification of Asian American women, and we see how that impacts these perceptions, impact policies and programs. So what I would say is that fiction and stories and characters like Ming Tsu become important because we want to fight back against the stereotypes about our communities. We want to educate folks about history. It seems like fiction is an easier entree to history for some people than reading long history books. So I think that's where it becomes really important for our work, that collectively we want to educate the whole country, society about the Chinese American and Asian American experience. And this is one way to do that is through literature. So final question to you, and I'll toss it back over to Center for Fiction, is how can readers and the audience follow you?
So I am not the only Tom Lin, as I discovered. So I am Tom_Lin___ at Instagram and Twitter. And my website is twotreeforest.com. And that's from my last name, Lin, which is Swanmulin. So Two Tree Forest, from the radical for the Chinese character for my last name. So twotreeforest.com and Tom_Lin__.
Great. So thank you very much, Tom. This was great. And I will toss it back over to Melanie.
Wayne, thank you so much. Wayne and Tom, that was such a great conversation. And for our audience, we'll drop the link in the chat again to buy The Thousand Crimes of Ming Tsu. Congratulations again, Tom, on this huge accomplishment. We hope it finds its way into the hands of many readers. And thank you both for talking with us tonight. And thanks to our audience as well. And we hope to see you all again soon.